Welcome to Chess with Simon. I am Simon, and this is Chewbacca the dog. He's only just not really visible. This is Chewbacca the dog. This is a sausage. Now he's visible. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a chess game by Lauren Kress. Lauren, in her day job, applies the disciplines of science to the world of business. She is the business scientist, but also she was the first to comment and the first to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and consequently we're going to look at one of her games. And if you comment and you subscribe, who knows what we might do. We're all a big community here. Anyway, we're going to look at one of Lauren's games. It's a really interesting game. It's basically, if you've seen The Queen's Gambit on Netflix, basically The Queen's Gambit with all the production values and all the excitement of Netflix, only in about 13 minutes and including a dog. I don't think there are any dogs in The Queen's Gambit, are there? So we're better. Anyway, and he might even get a sausage at some point. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this game. Lauren is playing black, so white has a slight advantage from the very beginning. She is also, as it happens on this case, is a few hundred, well, 250 ratings points lower than the other person. So it's a challenge for her. Let's see how she rises to it. So Kevin plays pawn to e4, pawn to king 4 in the old descriptive notation. This is a good move. I mean, basically in the opening, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make way for our pieces to develop. We're trying to stake a claim in the centre, control the centre, and we're trying to get the king castled and the king to safety. And this does all three. I mean, it puts a pawn in the centre, it allows the bishop to come out, and it starts to clear the way for the king to castle on the king's side. Although, you know, in some lines it would castle on a different side, the queen's side, or not at all in some lines. Lauren plays pawn to e5. Now, this video is kind of meant for everyone. It's not meant to be technical or overly clever. It's just meant to be a fun video that anyone can watch, even if you've not played chess very much or even ever. So if you're a beginner, I think pawn to e5 is a good move. It basically allows you to develop the pieces. It's a sensible move, but also the very best players in the world play this move as well. So it's a good move, and it's a sensible move for a beginner. Kevin brings out his knight to attack black's e-pawn. Now, there's a number of ways to cope with this. She can play knight c6 to defend it. She can play pawn d6, the Philidor defence. She can play knight f6, which is the Russian game, the Petrov defence, or even f5, which is the Latvian gambit, which is kind of bonkers, but I like to play. Lauren chooses probably the best move, although knight f6 is also a very good move. You know, is also completely sound. She chooses knight c6, which is a move with a lot of history and a lot of future. Kevin plays knight c3. Now, this is sort of hinting or heading towards a four knights game where if black brings out the king's knight, it's completely symmetric. Again, this is a decent game for white. I mean, I think black may be able to equalise, but it's a decent game for white. But Lauren's not going to do that. She brings her bishop out to c5, which is probably the best square for the bishop. And it's attacking the king's bishop's pawn. King's bishop's pawn is very important for two reasons. The first is because it's only defended by the king, which makes it a weak spot. And the second is, if you could beam a knight down there, it would be forking the queen and the rook, which is ever so handy. If you could beam a queen down there, it would be checkmate and the end of the game. Now, you can't beam a queen straight down there, but still, it is often the basis for an attack in chess, so it's a weak point. So this is a move which has got some ideas behind it. So since it's a good move, white goes and copies it and plays. Chewy's just flaked out. He's had a walk, a long walk in the cold and the rain. White copies it and moves the bishop to c4. Again, Lauren doesn't want to or doesn't create symmetry. She plays the pawn to d6, which allows her queen's bishop to come out, and as we'll see, this is something she uses very soon. Again, white's copying. So white's sort of almost copying her moves, which is really interesting. So Lauren says, we're not going to have any more of this. I'm going to play pawn to f6, and white can't play pawn to f3 because there's already a knight there. Now, pawn to f6 is somewhat unusual in this position. I've got to say, AlphaZero, the Google DeepMind AI, the very, very strong chess computer, sometimes plays f6 in these sort of positions. And so maybe this was a very forward-looking move. I mean, it defends the e-pawn. The only downside is, what about that knight, the king's knight? Where's that king's knight going to go? Because that would normally land on f6. But Lauren has a different plan for that knight, or certainly uses it in a different way. White castles on the king's side. This has just got to be sensible. I mean, get the king to safety. So white has now occupied the centre. Good, as has black. White's got his king to safety, and nearly finished his development. So white's doing pretty well here. Lauren gets out that queen's bishop onto g4, and all of a sudden you realise that's a really good square, because that's pinning the knight against the queen. So that is frustrating for white, because you can't move the knight, because she would take the queen. And actually you don't really want to move the queen, because then she could take the knight and disrupt. White would have to take back with the pawn in front of the king, and it would disrupt the pawns in front of the king, which is really not ideal. It's not the end of the world, but it's not ideal. So white realises this, and white plays pawn to h3 to try and push that bishop away, or make that bishop decide, or attack the bishop. But black's not having any of it. She just retreats the bishop and maintains the pin on the knight. Now white could push the other pawn to g4, and break the pin entirely. The only problem with that is you're shooting those pawns up the board, and that's the cover for the king. That's the king's defences, and it's not fatal, but it's also can be really risky. And anyway, white chooses not to do that. White moves queen to e2. Now this move isn't the best move, actually, and advanced players will be able to spot already a really good move for black. Lauren develops her last piece, which is really sensible. So knight to e7. That's a good square for the knight, and we got to develop our pieces to get the game going. And in fact, in development terms, black's now ahead of white, because black's developed her last piece and white hasn't yet. But white makes up for that by pushing bishop to e3. This is an interesting move from black. So I think it's a good move. Black plays pawn b6. And what this is doing is developing the defending the bishop, and defending it in a different way. So when actually white does take, black can take back with the b pawn, and it opens the b file, which may be useful for that rook, but also increases the control over the centre, because now there's no time. I mean, white cannot play pawn to d4 anymore, because there's those two pawns covering the d4 square. So this was a really good bit of thinking, I think. White plays a3. I mean, a3 is a decent move. The idea is to be able to hide away the bishop. The only problem is, I would say, maybe a bit slow, because there's other things going on, like knight to g6. Now, knight to g6 is a fascinating move. The fear is that it comes to h4 and attacks that knight, which is pinned against the queen, and starts to create pressure. It looks like white can play pawn to g4, which will then trap the bishop. Actually, white can't do that, because if white does that, black moves the knight to f4, which hits the queen, and then that creates space so the bishop can slip away. So actually, this is a tricky move. And white, I think, plays a good move here, which is pawn to g3. So the idea of pawn to g3 is that, yeah, you like that move? Yeah. The idea of pawn to g3 is that it stops the knight jumping into f4, which would have been a nightmare, like hitting the queen and what have you. Do you want to get down? He doesn't know. Just move it around, I think. So Lauren, then, having provoked this weakness from white, Lauren backs her knight back to e7. White endeavours to swap off the knight, so Lauren agrees, but then she moves her knight into d4. Now this is a really good move. This is probably the game-winning move, because it's attacking the queen, but it's also attacking the knight, and the knight cannot take, because then it'll lose a whole queen, so the queen will get taken. So white can't take, so white runs away with the queen. This allows black to take, so black's now a whole piece ahead. And also, that bishop buzzing around the king is really irritating, and it's attacking the queen. So all of a sudden, black's in a really strong position. White moves the queen to stop it getting taken. Black plays pawn to f5. Again, I think this is a really good move. It's a really thoughtful, kind of aggressive move. So, number one, it's clearing the way, so the queen can move up that dark square diagonal and attack the king's side. You getting down? Are you? Number one, it's allowing the queen to move onto the king's side. And number two, it's threatening to march right up and disrupt the pawns that are defending the king. So, this is the top move. White wants to push away that knight because it's horrible, defending the bishop and just threatening the king. So black moves the pawn in, checks the king. Now the king has one square, which is h2. So all of a sudden, I think white's feeling really worried here. I mean, white can't take it with the queen because black just takes back. And given that black's already a piece up, it would be a whole queen up, and that is probably game over. Just like in the Queen's Gambit, when the guy asks her to resign when she loses her queen. See, it's all here. Black plays king to h2, which is essentially forced. White plays king to h2. White plays king to h2, which is essentially forced. Black then pushes on. You see, the reason I said black is I just want to be black. Black's doing really well here. Black pushes on, and as predicted, that pawn is threatening to take on g3 and disrupt the defence of the king. I think white sees the danger, so white takes. Black takes back, and that knight, I mean, you should... In one's games, it's really good to get a knight like this, because this knight is an absolute dream. I mean, it can't be taken by any minor piece, because there's no dark square bishop, and white doesn't have any knights left. So there's no way of taking this knight, and look at the squares it's attacking. It's attacking all the squares around the king. It's really well centralised. It's a monster knight. White plays queen e3, which is threatening that loose bishop. The loose bishop is not defended. The loose bishop then moves, and strictly forking the rook and the pawn. So white's now played rook g1. So what white wants to do is take on g2, then black takes back, then white takes back with the king. So that's a rook, which is worth 5 pawns, for a knight and a bishop, both worth about 3.5 pawns each. So it's about 7 pawns. So that's a really good deal for white. So white would love to do that. The only problem is it's black's move. And black is able to take on h3. Lauren's able to take on h3. So now, to be honest with you, looking at this game, you've got to believe black's going to win this. I mean, if white gets away with this, it's a miracle escape. I mean, black's king is still in the centre. But you've got to back black in this game. White pushes a pawn, perhaps to try to undermine that annoying knight. So the pawn on e5 is defending the knight. And the question is, for instance, if black took on d4, the knight would hang, would drop, and all of a sudden white's back in the game. But black doesn't fall for it. Black plays queen to h4, and this is really now a crisis, because when that bishop moves, there's going to be a check. The bishop could move somewhere awkward. It's big problems for white, and so white needs to come up with big solutions. And white comes up with the best move in the position, which is queen g3. So I would say, yeah, pretty good move, queen g3, threatening to swap off the queens and take the heat out of the black attack. Now, actually, black is doing so well that she can swap the queens and still win, because she's got more material, but she wants more. Moves the queen back, so preserving the threats. White really here is low on ideas. I mean, actually, white can move the queen to g5 and keep offering the swap to try to stave off immediate disaster, but just takes. So now that black knight finally is actually free. So white has got this project, and we all need a project. White has got this project to try and get rid of that horrible knight on f4. Nearly achieves it, takes on e5, but black has got a super duper move. Bishop f5, this is check from the queen. The king can't move to g2 because that pesky knight is covering the square. King can't move back because the queen is covering it. The only piece that can block is the queen. But if it does, black just takes. Let's just play it out. Come on. So let's say the queen went there. This didn't happen in the game because actually white resigned. But let's just see the final throws, and then all that black needs to do is to take the queen on h3, and it is the end of the game. Checkmate. So really good game by Lauren. I think she's done a great job. I think for that, the dog gets a sausage. You like that, Chewy? Go on, bite. He wants the whole thing. Should we give him the whole thing? We give him the whole thing. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed watching it. Please like or subscribe. What do they always say on YouTube? Please like, comment, or hit the subscribe button. If you comment, if you want to leave one of your games, then maybe we'll take a look at it together. It could be fun. He might take a look at it. I hope you've had a good time. We've had a good time. He's escaping now. All he wanted me for was the food. He's escaping. We're escaping. And we will see you next time.